To anyone looking in from the outside, Tara Grant's life seemed almost cinematic. A beautiful, successful businesswoman, a dedicated mother of two, a suburban home nestled in the quiet safety of Washington Township. Her neighbors saw a loving couple raising their children together. Tara, always polished and poised, was frequently traveling for work, but she never missed a phone call home. And Stephen, her husband, often appeared the caring, stay-at-home dad. He cooked, cleaned, and handled the day-to-day chaos of raising kids. But behind the white picket fence, all was not well. Tara had been growing distant from Stephen. Her frequent business trips to Puerto Rico were more than just work obligations. They were a temporary escape. Stephen, once proud of Tara's ambition, had turned bitter. He felt emasculated, abandoned, angry. He resented her long absences and the control she held over their family's finances. Their arguments had grown more intense. Neighbors had noticed raised voices behind closed doors. Still, no one expected the storm that was coming. On the evening of February 9, 2007, Tara returned home from another business trip. Snow dusted the lawn as the couple sat in their house, the kids already tucked into bed. What should have been a quiet evening after a long flight became a final confrontation. Voices rose, words cut deep, something snapped, and then silence. The next morning, Tara was nowhere to be found. Stephen told everyone she'd left after an argument, just stormed out and never came back. He didn't report her missing until 5 days later. His explanation felt off. Her phone was off, her car was untouched, her children, everything Tara lived for, were still at home. But Stephen didn't seem worried. And soon, neither did the police, at first. But Tara's sister wasn't buying it. She knew Tara. She felt something was wrong. The perfect suburban life had just cracked, and nobody realized that behind the polished family portrait, a nightmare had already begun. Tara Grant had vanished. There was no trace, no note, no call, no signs of distress. But the man she left behind was calm. Too calm. On February 14, 2007, Valentine's Day, Stephen Grant finally walked into the sheriff's office and reported his wife missing. He claimed she left after a fight, got into a black car with an unknown person, and simply disappeared. According to him, it wasn't unusual. She had done it before, walked out in frustration, and returned days later. She needed space, he insisted. She was under pressure from work. But something didn't sit right. Tara had a meticulous routine. Her phone was never off. She never missed work. And above all, she would never abandon her kids. Her sister, Alicia, immediately raised alarm bells. Tara had confided in her about Stephen, how controlling he had become, how the house didn't feel safe anymore. As media caught wind of the story, Stephen leaned into the spotlight. He gave interviews, he sobbed on camera, he begged for Tara to come home. But the more he spoke, the more suspicious he seemed. He mentioned little details nobody had asked about. He contradicted himself. His tears came too easily, then vanished in seconds. Maybe she meant someone, he suggested at one point. Maybe she doesn't want to be found. The police began watching him. Back at the Grant home, detectives were quietly building a timeline. They asked for phone records, flight logs, surveillance. They scanned Tara's emails, her credit cards, her phone activity. Nothing after February 9. Then came a curious tip. A neighbor mentioned hearing power tools in the Grant garage late at night on the very evening Tara disappeared. That changed everything. Investigators obtained a search warrant. On March 2, 2007, they walked into the garage and opened a large blue Tupperware container hidden behind boxes. Inside, they found Tara's torso. The missing woman was never missing. She had been there the whole time, dismembered in her own home. While Stephen spoke to reporters and cared for their children, his secret was rotting just a few feet away. The act was over. Now the real horror was about to begin. When Stephen Grant sat for interviews, the world saw a grieving husband, distraught, confused, desperate for answers. He looked into the camera with tired eyes and pleaded for his wife's return. "Tara, if you're out there," he said, voice trembling, "just come home. We miss you." It was a performance. In reality, Stephen already knew Tara wasn't coming home. He had killed her with his bare hands, dismembered her body in their garage, and stuffed parts of her into a container just feet from where their children played. But to the public, he was just another heartbroken man, and he used every second of airtime to shape the narrative in his favor. At first, people believed him. His emotion looked genuine, his story had details. But police had already begun noticing inconsistencies. Why had he waited 5 days to report her missing? Why did he keep changing the timeline of her disappearance? Why was he giving so many interviews instead of cooperating with investigators? When they found Tara's torso, everything changed. Stephen didn't stick around. As the media circled and investigators swarmed his home, he vanished, slipping out before he could be questioned. His vehicle was later found abandoned near northern Michigan's wilderness. Police feared the worst. Was he planning suicide, or was he running? A massive manhunt began. Helicopters flew over the woods. Dogs tracked his scent. For days, Stephen was gone. Then, just when hope was fading, they found him. On March 4, he was discovered near Wilderness State Park, shirtless and freezing, curled up in the snow. He was suffering from hypothermia and frostbite. Rescuers rushed him to the hospital, and that's when the real Stephen finally emerged. While lying in a hospital bed, he confessed. Tara had come home that night. They argued, again. This time it turned violent. He choked her in the bedroom while their children slept. When she died, he didn't panic. He planned. He waited until morning, took the kids to a relative's house, and began cutting Tara's body apart. He scattered pieces in a nearby park. He hid what was left in the garage. Then he called the news stations and played the grieving husband. It wasn't guilt that broke him. It was cold. To the world, Tara and Stephen Grant seemed like a modern couple, young, educated, attractive, with 2 adorable children and a suburban home in Washington Township. But inside the walls of that home, something toxic had been growing for years. Stephen wasn't just insecure, he was resentful. Tara had a thriving career as a high-level consultant. She often traveled for business, earning significantly more than Stephen, who had taken on the role of stay-at-home dad. At first, it made sense, but slowly, Stephen began to feel diminished. He wasn't the breadwinner, he wasn't in charge. And worst of all, Tara was beginning to see it too. Friends and family noticed a shift. Tara had become more distant from Stephen. She began confiding in her sister about their marriage troubles. She even hinted at a possible separation. But she stayed, mostly for the kids. Stephen, meanwhile, became increasingly controlling. He monitored her phone calls. He complained about every business trip. He resented the time she spent away. When she came home, he interrogated her, accused her of cheating, demanded her attention. The night of February 9th, all of that boiled over. In his confession, Stephen described their final argument in disturbing detail. He had been waiting for her to return from Puerto Rico, stewing in anger. When she walked in late that night, the fight began immediately. He accused, she denied, she threatened to leave him. That's when he snapped. He choked her until she stopped moving. Then he just stood there, silent, alone. But rather than call for help, Stephen began covering his tracks. He dismembered her body with tools from the garage, he scrubbed surfaces, packed her torso in a plastic container, and stored it behind some junk. Then he took their kids to breakfast the next morning, like nothing happened. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was calculated, cold. Stephen didn't just kill Tara, he erased her, piece by piece. The Grants' garage wasn't just messy, it was off. When investigators first entered the home on a routine search, they weren't expecting to find what they did. Neatly packed boxes were stacked in corners, toys lay forgotten on the shelves. But something stopped them cold, an overwhelming, putrid smell. It wasn't gasoline, it wasn't rotting food. It was unmistakably human decay. One officer noticed a large plastic storage bin tucked behind a row of boxes. It looked oddly out of place, recently moved, slightly bulging, its lid not quite shut. They approached carefully. The moment they opened the bin, the room filled with the sickening scent of death. Inside was the torso of a woman, wrapped in plastic, stuffed tightly into the container. It was Tara. There was no more pretending, no more press conferences, no more tears from Stephen Grant. The case had officially shifted from a missing person to a murder. Crime scene techs swept the garage. They found blood spotter traces under a fresh coat of paint. In the basement drain, DNA swabs matched Tara. Tools were collected, a hacksaw, a box cutter, cleaning supplies. It was all there. This wasn't panic. This was planning. Stephen had carefully dismembered his wife and stored her like garbage. His choice to keep part of her in the garage was bold or foolish. Maybe he thought no one would look there, or maybe he believed he could control the narrative for just a little longer. What he didn't expect was the smell, the evidence, the neighbors who heard the buzz of power tools at odd hours, the tip that led police straight to the bin of horrors. As news broke of the discovery, the public recoiled. The story of the handsome, grieving husband crumbled overnight. The father baking cookies and pushing strollers was now a killer who had butchered the mother of his children. Behind the garage door of a suburban home, the American dream had turned into a real-life horror movie, and its villain had written the script himself. The blue Rubbermaid bin sat like an unholy coffin in the middle of the garage floor. Ordinary to most eyes, but to detectives, it screamed. Inside was Tara Grant's torso. No arms, no legs, no head. Just the silent remains of a woman who had once filled rooms with laughter, ambition, and love for her children. What Stephen Grant did wasn't just murder, it was dehumanization. Investigators took a long, shaken breath before documenting the scene. They didn't expect to find a body so surgically handled. Tara's torso had been severed with precision. Autopsy reports would later show that after strangling her, Stephen had waited, maybe for courage, maybe for silence. Then he began cutting her apart. Not once, not in panic, but over the course of several hours. He used a hacksaw, he cleaned, he planned. After hiding her torso in the garage bin, he drove the remaining body parts, arms, legs, her head, to Stony Creek Metro Park, just a few miles away. There, he scattered them under brush and leaves like discarded waste. Then, he went home, cleaned himself up, and tucked his children into bed. The gruesome discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Reporters stood outside the Grant home, stunned. Tara's family broke down in grief. The media dubbed it the Tupperware murder, not for drama, but for the sheer absurdity and brutality of storing a body like leftovers in the garage. But the bin told a bitter story. It held not just Tara's remains, but evidence, fibers, blood, DNA, fingerprints. It destroyed any chance of Stephen maintaining innocence. His staged interviews, his carefully scripted answers, all of it was now laughable. The container made his lies collapse. Inside that plastic tomb was the proof of a calculated cover-up and the beginning of his unraveling. But one question haunted everyone. How could he live with it? For weeks? Cook dinner in that house? Sleep upstairs? Take his kids to school? All while her torso lay boxed up behind the car? The answer was chillingly simple. Stephen Grant had already put her away, in life and in death. While investigators processed the horror found in the garage, a deeper question loomed. Where was the rest of Tara? Stephen Grant hadn't just hidden her torso. He'd taken other parts of her body, her limbs, her head, and driven them to Stony Creek Metro Park, a vast wooded area not far from the family's home. It was quiet, isolated, and blanketed in February snow. The perfect place to forget a crime. But the woods remember everything. Under tangled branches and thin sheets of ice, police and cadaver dogs began combing the park. It didn't take long. A gloved hand sticking out from under a frozen log. A severed leg caught in the reeds. Bits of plastic. Duct tape. The macabre trail Stephen left behind was now being traced in reverse. It was as if he thought the snow would erase it all. But snow melts, and so do lies. Detectives documented each discovery with shaking hands and heavy hearts. The remains were scattered, not buried, as though Tara's death was more of an inconvenience than a tragedy. To Stephen, she had become something to get rid of, not mourn. As search teams unearthed bone after bone, one haunting thought gripped everyone involved. Tara had been dismantled like an object, disposed of in parts, left in the woods where animals roam and memories fade. Why such brutality? Why not a single burial? The answer was in Stephen's confession, cold and flat. I needed to make her go away. The park, once a place of family picnics and weekend jogs, had become a crime scene of unspeakable violence. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Reporters were kept back as teams continued to collect what remained of a once vibrant woman. Back at the station, detectives pieced together a chilling timeline. While the children slept, he had murdered. While they watched cartoons, he had dismembered their mother. And while they went to school, he had scattered her like trash across the woods. The trees had been silent witnesses. Now they whispered everything. As the discovery of Tara's body made headlines, one critical figure had disappeared, Stephen Grant. Just hours after police found the torso in his garage, Stephen slipped away. He didn't wait for questions, he didn't run to a lawyer, he didn't even say goodbye to his kids. Instead, he vanished into northern Michigan, taking only a few supplies and leaving his abandoned vehicle near a dense forest. It was cold, dangerously cold. Temperatures were dropping below freezing. But Stephen knew these woods. He'd camped there before. He was prepared to disappear or dying trying. The manhunt exploded overnight. Helicopters circled overhead, state troopers and FBI agents joined the search. Bloodhounds sniffed through trails. His face appeared on every news outlet in the state. Some feared he was trying to flee to Canada. Others worried he had planned a final escape, a coward's way out. But Stephen wasn't dead. Not yet. On the morning of March 4th, 2007, 2 days after his disappearance, a snowmobiler found a half-naked man curled up under a tree in Wilderness State Park. He was freezing, shivering uncontrollably, and barely conscious. It was Stephen. He was rushed to a hospital suffering from hypothermia, frostbite, and exposure. He hadn't made far, and certainly hadn't made a clean escape. Nature had done what justice hadn't yet. Stopped him cold. In the hospital, strapped to IVs and wrapped in heated blankets, Stephen began to talk. Not with a lawyer, not with hesitation, just the truth, plain and brutal. He confessed to it all. The argument, the strangulation, the dismemberment, the park, the bin in the garage. His words were chillingly detached, like someone describing a bad dream, not a human life taken. He even admitted that part of him wanted to get caught, that maybe running into the woods was his version of penance or punishment. But it wasn't over, not even close. Stephen was now in custody, but the legal battle was just beginning. And the public, once fooled by his tearful interviews, now saw the real face behind the performance, a man capable of the unimaginable. Lying in a hospital bed, wrapped in warm blankets and watched closely by guards, Stephen Grant finally broke his silence. His body was weak from the cold, his skin was blistered from frostbite, but his mind, still calculating, still cruel. When detectives entered the room, Stephen didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't cry. He didn't even hesitate. What came next was a chilling, matter-of-fact confession that left the officers stunned. He started with the night of February 9. Tara had come home from her business trip late. Stephen was waiting, angry, convinced she was having an affair, furious about her absences. The kids were asleep upstairs as they argued. Stephen described Tara as cold, distant. He claimed she told him he was a failure, that she didn't love him anymore. And then he snapped. "I put my hands around her neck and didn't stop," he said. Stephen told them how she stopped moving, how her body went limp. He paused, not to grieve, but to think. He didn't panic. He didn't call for help. Instead, he began cleaning. He laid out tools in the garage, a hacksaw, a blade. He described the process of dismembering her with mechanical detail, as if he were describing how to take apart a car. He wrapped the pieces, hid the torso in a bin, drove the rest to the woods, came home, cleaned up. Then he made the kids breakfast the next morning. Detective sat in stunned silence, recording every word. There was no emotion in his voice, no regret, no sadness. It was as though Tara wasn't a person, just a problem he had to solve. When asked why he didn't just leave the marriage, Stephen shrugged. "She was going to take the kids," he muttered. "She didn't need me." The interview ended not with an apology, but with a final haunting statement. "I just wanted her to stop." It was the moment the public would never forget. Not because he confessed, but because he showed no humanity. No regret, just ego. Just control. Stephen Grant had told the truth, but it wasn't a relief. It was terrifying. With Stephen's hospital confession in hand, investigators finally had the full picture of what happened inside the Grant home, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. Forensic teams meticulously reconstructed the timeline from Tara's return home on February 9 to the gruesome discoveries weeks later. They matched Stephen's words to the physical evidence, the saw marks on bones, the fibers in the garage, the cleaning agents used on the basement floor. But it wasn't just a matter of what he did, it was how coldly he carried it out. He didn't just kill Tara, he separated her piece by piece, her limbs, her head, carefully placing each one in bags, containers, and eventually the snowy woods. He cut through muscle, joint, and bone, then stored her torso like a forgotten object in a blue plastic bin. In one haunting detail, he told investigators that he left her head for last because he couldn't look at her face. The evidence painted a picture of a man who didn't panic, didn't lose control in a single impulsive moment, but rather made a deliberate, extended decision to erase his wife. Meanwhile, Tara's family was devastated. Her sister Alicia, who had begged police to take the case seriously in the beginning, now had the worst kind of vindication. Her niece and nephew had lost not only their mother, but effectively their father too, and all of it had played out behind a mask of suburban normalcy. Stephen had driven past those woods, tucked his kids in at night, and appeared on television, all while his wife's dismembered body was rotting in a park and in a box just steps from their kitchen. Even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend the level of detachment and violence involved. One officer called it the most cold-blooded act of domestic murder I've ever seen. And though Stephen had confessed, he still wanted a trial, still wanted to talk, still thought, somewhere deep inside, that maybe people would understand his side. But no one did. Not anymore. By the time Stephen Grant stood trial in late 2007, his face was already infamous across Michigan. The once sympathetic husband was now branded a monster, a man who smiled for cameras while his wife's body decomposed in a bin and in a box just steps from their kitchen. Even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend the level of detachment and violence involved. One officer called it the most cold-blooded act of domestic murder I've ever seen. And though Stephen had confessed, he still wanted a trial, still wanted to talk, still thought, somewhere deep inside, that maybe people would understand his side. But no one did. Not anymore. By the time Stephen Grant stood trial in late 2007, his face was already infamous across Michigan. The once sympathetic husband was now branded a monster, a man who smiled for cameras while his wife's body decomposed in a bin. But in the courtroom, Stephen still tried to control the story. His lawyers pushed for second-degree murder, claiming the act was not premeditated, just the result of a sudden emotional outburst. They painted Stephen as overwhelmed, isolated, emasculated. They said Tara's constant traveling left him insecure, that the fight escalated, that he just lost it. But the prosecution had other ideas. They brought in forensic evidence, his own taped confession, and witness testimony that revealed a very different man. Cold, controlling, calculated. They showed how he'd waited until morning to dismember Tara, how he'd cleaned up, made phone calls, and lied to friends and family while hiding her remains. They argued this wasn't a man who snapped, this was a man who planned his cover-up with precision. Tara's sister, Alicia, took the stand and described how Tara had feared Stephen in the weeks leading up to her death. She read aloud texts and emails that hinted at divorce and Stephen's growing volatility. The courtroom fell silent as she broke down, telling the jury, he didn't just take her life, he stole her future, he robbed her children. Perhaps most disturbingly, Stephen himself chose to speak. He cried on the stand, apologized, blamed stress. He told the jury, I loved her, I didn't mean to do it. But no one believed him anymore. The charm was gone, the act was exposed. On December 21, 2007, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder and mutilation of a dead body. Some jurors had pushed for first degree, but couldn't reach a unanimous decision. At sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. He called Stephen demonic, manipulative, and barbaric. He said, you didn't just kill your wife, you butchered her, and then you lied about it for weeks, knowing her children would never see her again. Stephen was sentenced to 50 to 80 years in prison. Justice had been served, but for Tara's family, it would never be enough. On February 21, 2008, Stephen Grant stood before the court one last time. He wore a prison-issued jumpsuit, no longer the smug suburban dad in front of news cameras, but a pale, broken man, shackled, shrunken. His trial was over, but the moment everyone had been waiting for was just beginning, sentencing. The courtroom was packed. Tara's family sat in the front row, clutching tissues, bracing themselves. Her children weren't there, too young to understand, too innocent to witness the man who destroyed their family. Then Judge John Chimera spoke, and the fury in his voice stunned everyone. This is not just about murder, the judge began. It's about cruelty. It's about selfishness. It's about evil. He looked directly at Stephen and continued. You didn't just kill your wife, you mutilated her, you dismembered her, and you lied to the world, while your children played in the same house where you stored her torso in a bin. You paraded around as the grieving husband. You used your own kids as props in your sick game. Stephen didn't flinch. The judge wasn't finished. I've never seen a case where a person has shown such callous disregard for human life, not just for the victim, but for the lives around her. Your children will grow up without a mother because of you, and they will know what you did. Tara's sister wept quietly in the gallery. Other relatives nodded through tears. Then came the sentence, 50 to 80 years in prison for second-degree murder and mutilation of a corpse. Effectively, a life sentence. Stephen said nothing, no apology, no emotion, just a blank stare, like a man who still didn't understand the gravity of what he had done. Outside the courtroom, reporters asked Tara's family if they felt justice had been done. Her sister spoke softly. We can't bring Tara back, but he will never hurt anyone again. It wasn't closure, but it was a start. When Stephen Grant murdered Tara, he didn't just take her life, he shattered the world of their 2 children. At the time of her death, their daughter was 6, their son only 4. Too young to understand death, far too young to understand murder by their own father. In the weeks following Tara's disappearance, Stephen had continued his daily parenting routines, school runs, playtime, meals, all while her body was hidden in their garage. The children had lived within arm's reach of horror without knowing it. And when the truth emerged, everything fell apart. Tara's sister, Alicia Standerfer, stepped in immediately. She gained custody of the children and relocated them to a safer environment, away from cameras, reporters, and the trauma-infused home they once knew. The children were told the truth, in fragments, gently, carefully, but no version of the truth could soften the devastation. They were now orphans in a way the world rarely sees. One parent murdered, the other the murderer. For Alicia, the transition from aunt to guardian was painful. She had lost her sister. Now she had to carry Tara's memory and raise her children who looked like Tara, sounded like her, and sometimes asked questions she didn't have the strength to answer. Therapists were brought in, counseling became routine, but the emotional damage ran deep. What do you tell a child who wakes from a nightmare calling for a mother who's never coming back? As the years passed, Alicia made a promise. Tara's story would not end in silence. She began speaking publicly about domestic violence, using her sister's story to raise awareness. She launched an annual walk, Tara's Walk, to honor victims of abuse and give survivors a voice. And through it all, the children grew. Quietly, privately, away from the headlines. Now, young adults, they have largely stayed out of the public eye, their lives fiercely protected by the aunt who stepped up when everything fell apart. They live with the truth every day, but they also live with strength, a strength born from loss and from the memory of a mother who never stopped loving them. In the wake of unimaginable loss, Tara Grant's family refused to let her name fade into a crime statistic. Her sister, Alicia, took her pain and transformed it into purpose by launching Tara's Walk, an annual event in Michigan aimed at raising awareness about domestic violence. What began as a tribute soon grew into a powerful platform. Survivors, families, and advocates gathered year after year, walking in Tara's memory, not just to honor her, but to speak for those still trapped in silence. Each step carried a message. Domestic abuse hides in plain sight. Alicia spoke at schools, shelters, and forums, urging people to notice the red flags, the isolation, the control, the fear masked behind smiles. She wanted people to understand that what happened to Tara didn't begin with violence. It began with control, manipulation, and silence. Tara's Walk became more than an event. It became a movement. And through it, her name lived on, not in headlines about her death, but in hope for those still fighting to live.